and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Obus Partners. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about debt-to-income ratios and how they're going to impact property prices. So the Reserve Bank just a week or so ago came out and said, we are going to bring in debt-to-income ratios and we expect to do it about June, July. And a lot of people are saying, well, if the amount of debt New Zealand can take out is limited by our incomes, well, what's going to happen to house prices? Are they going to go down? Are they going to go up? Are they going to keep going up as fast as they have in the past? Well, we're going to dig through a lot of interesting data today, looking at incomes and also what's happened to other countries that are a similar size to us and what's happened to their house prices when they've introduced debt-to-income ratio restrictions, which is really interesting. Now, Andrew, the first thing that we need to think about is how quickly incomes tend to go up over time.
Okay, so since the year 2000, household income in New Zealand have gone up by 4.58%. And if you compound that, because of course house growth is compounding, it works out to be 4.1%. So it's somewhere between 4% and 5% per year, depending on the measure that you look at. And that gives you a sense of how fast house prices could go up if everyone was maxed out. So if everyone was at the 6 or 7 times debt to income ratio now, and we could only borrow when our income went up, then that would be the amount that it would go up by.
Yeah, so somewhere between 4 to 5%, but it's interesting how different it is in some years. So in 2008, the average household income in New Zealand grew by 8.4%. The year after, it shrank by 0.31% because we were in a recession. More recently, in 2020, household income's up 5.7, then 4.4. Most recently, 2023, household incomes went up 5.6%. So there are certainly some years where income growth is actually pretty substantial. So over time, somewhere between 4 to 5% is what you'd expect household incomes to go up by. So that kind of gives you a sense of the maximum limit. If we were all borrowing as much as possible, how much house prices could potentially go up by. But what's really important to know is not everyone is already borrowing their maximum amount.
Just you and me.
And in fact, let me just pull this up. I was on our website the other day, and actually, if you actually Google average DTI in New Zealand, this always cracks me up. Our article comes up.
Excellent.
And then I go through and think, I wonder what the average is. And I will quickly show you it, Andrew. The average debt to income in New Zealand at the moment is about 1.65. 1.65 times.
Which is significantly lower than what I would have thought. And now a big part of this, though, when Ed and I were discussing this at dinner the other day, this is what we do, go out for dinner and discuss debt-to-income ratios. A lot of this is because so many people in New Zealand don't actually have a mortgage or have a relatively low mortgage, right?
Yeah, so if you think about it, a third of New Zealanders don't have a mortgage. So maybe you're 65, 70 years old, you've paid off your mortgage over time or whatever it happens to be. Maybe you inherited a house and you've turned it into a rental property and mum and dad had paid off the mortgage. Well, that doesn't have a mortgage on it, so that will pull down the average debt to income. Similarly, if you think about tenants, the average tenant doesn't have a mortgage. And so their debt to income will be quite low. They might have a credit card, they might have a personal loan, but generally speaking, we don't actually have as much debt as you would think.
So if you took out the people that don't have a mortgage, what would it actually average out to be?
Now, I knew you were going to ask me this.
No, you told me an answer. So I want to see if that was a made-up answer, and now you're going to have to rethink it through.
No. My understanding is it's somewhere between 3 and 4. I think it's the midpoint of 3 and 4.
Yeah.
I have read it in Reserve Bank reports in the past, but as I was preparing for this,
you couldn't find
10
it.
p.m. last night, I couldn't find the exact figure. But it's somewhere between 3 to 4 for people who have mortgages. And so what that shows you is these restrictions probably won't have an impact on the average person, but there will be some people who are affected. That's what we say at the margin. At the margin, people will be impacted. So perhaps 5 to 10% of people who previously would have been able to get a mortgage, maybe they won't be able to anymore when interest rates eventually come down. So it should take some heat out of the market, but it's not going to quash house prices. House prices will still go up, but perhaps not quite as fast as they have in the past.
Or maybe you won't have these major jumps, right?
Yeah, there's major spikes. It will likely be more steady as house prices go up. And actually, that's been the experience in Norway, and perhaps we'll dig into that in a second. And speaking of other countries, Andrew, we are not the first country in the world to bring in debt-to-income restrictions. In fact, when you look at the Reserve Bank's reports, they point to similarly sized countries like the Czech Republic, Norway, Ireland, and even Slovakia and Latvia, I think. They say these are countries with a similar population that have brought in debt-to-income ratio restrictions. So let's go across the world and figure out, what impact has or what's happened to house prices when they've brought these in.
Yeah, so the Reserve Bank actually has this on page 24.95 if you're a nerd like Ed and want to look it up. And this is in their consultation paper, which is the paper that they put out so that banks and the public can make suggestions around how the rules are implemented. And the quote from there is, the international evidence is mixed around the impact of macroprudential tools, which are the LVR tools and debt-to-income ratio restrictions, on house prices, with some studies finding significant impacts and others finding little to no impact.
Yeah, so in some cases, big studies happening, we brought in debt-to-income ratios, actually didn't have much of an impact.
So why do it then?
Well, I think the main thing is this isn't actually about controlling house prices, right? Like the Reserve Bank is not bringing in DTIs or LVR restrictions to try and slow down house prices. Now, that may be a secondary impact. The reason they're bringing this in is they're saying if people take out too much debt and house prices absolutely boom, well, if house prices then collapse and fall rapidly and people have taken out too much debt, and there's been a little bit of that recently, well, that can mean we have a big recession and a recession that lasts much longer. So if you look at the average recession, it might last for example, 12 months. But if you have a recession and at the same time you have a property bubble burst, or you have property prices rapidly fall, that could make that recession, instead of 12 months, it might be 24 months. Instead of GDP falling by 1%, it might fall by 2 or 3%. So they're trying to stop people taking out too much debt and then have house prices rapidly fall. That's what this tool is all about. Now, as I said, the Reserve Bank points to a couple of different countries who have brought in DTIs, and I want to start with Ireland, because after they brought in the debt-to-income ratios in 2015, we have still seen house prices go up. They went up 11% in 2015, 2017, they went up 11%, 2019, 2020 during COVID, only 2% or 0%. Recently, 2022, about 12%. So it's interesting that even though they brought DTIs in, and their DTIs are a lot lower than ours. I'm pretty sure they're 3.5, 4.5 times, maybe 5.5. Even though they've brought them in, they're more restrictive, we've still seen house prices go up relatively substantially.
And if you average that out, it's about 7% per year if it was averaged out, which is really interesting because that's
6.4%.
No, I don't think you're right.
Yeah, it is, because I've got it here for you.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
Well, then...
I prepared these notes for you.
But that's still pretty good growth. I'd be pretty happy with that over a 7-year period.
6.4% is a lot higher than what I thought it would be. But Ireland is a bit of an interesting case, and you need to remember, what happened directly before 2015. So between 1990 and 2007, Irish house prices just like it is the literal definition of frog in a sock. It is the literal definition. When the Australians came up with that phrase, they were definitely thinking about Irish property prices. Because they went up between 1990, which I've chosen because that's roughly when our price data started, and through to 2007, they averaged 10.6% a year, right?
That's obscene.
Yeah, they went up in value 4.5 times in just 17 years.
But look at the crash after that.
Well, that's the interesting thing. So after that, house prices dropped over 50% over the next 5 years. So Ireland had this massive property price crash that would have really impacted people. So the fact that they had house prices fall so much and then they introduced debt to income restrictions, some of this recovery will just be because Irish house prices fell so much, right? So whenever you have a big crash, you'll always have a relatively decent recovery. So we're not saying that, oh, well, look, they introduced debt to income ratio restrictions and property prices went up. That's exactly what's going to happen. Well, no, because what's happened in Ireland at the time they brought these in is slightly different from what's happened with us. We've had house prices fall, but they've only fallen about 18% in New Zealand after the COVID peaks. And so, yep, debt to income ratio restrictions, we could still see house prices increase like we did in Ireland, but it might not be quite as quick because they really had property prices crash before they've seen this recovery. But Andrew, let's talk about another country now. Let's talk about maybe Latvia in Eastern Europe, because they also brought in debt to income ratios. Back in 2007, they brought them in.
Yeah, so a little bit harder to get their data, but since 2009, Latvian house prices have doubled every 13 years. So that works out to be an average of about 6.7% per year. And in 2022, house prices went up 14% there, which is huge.
Yeah. And again, the same thing's not necessarily going to happen in New Zealand, right?
No, again, we're not saying that debt to income ratios are a great thing and they're going to cause property house prices to go up. All we're saying is they're not necessarily a negative thing that is going to stop house prices going up.
Yeah, I think what you'd say is in Latvia, debt to income ratios came in and house prices, they did not stop house prices going up by over 6%. Same thing in Ireland. They came in, house prices still went up by over 6%.
Interesting, the only difference between Latvian house prices and Irish house prices is that these guys have had negative growth back in 2015, whereas on the 7 years that we had for Ireland, the lowest growth was zero, not negative.
Yeah, I think over there, since they've brought in, about 0%. But again, the Irish experience is quite interesting because of those big falls. And the last one I would look at is Norway. So they brought in debt to income ratio restrictions in 2015. Now, I'm pretty sure it's 2015, but I don't read Norwegian, so it can be the exact date. They've changed them a couple of times, and you look online, and then it's in Norwegian, and you think, oh, I'm not Nordic. I don't really, does the Google Translate work quite well? I don't know.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Well, I
apologise. No, keep that in. I apologise for anyone who's offended by that.
I was about to say Guten Tag, and that's German. But anyway, I'm sorry to the Norwegian community listening to the Property Academy podcast in New Zealand. But since 2015, Norway house prices are up 42%. That is a little bit slower than Latvia and Ireland, but 4.4% is still pretty fast. Like in 2021, house prices went up almost 10.5%. 2022, about 5%. 2016, the year after they brought it in, 7%. Yeah, they've had some slower years. 1%, 2%. But again, it's kind of not the end of the world. Like it is on the slower side, but it's also not terrible. And so it's interesting to read that comment from the Reserve Bank, where they say, when you look at other countries, debt to income ratios, macro-prudential tools, the evidence is a bit mixed. And then you dig into some of these other countries like Norway, Latvia, Ireland, all a similar size to us, and you think, oh yeah, okay, house prices still going to go up. Maybe it won't be the 7% that we've seen in the past. Maybe it's going to be 5 or 6% like it has been in Ireland, Norway, and Latvia. But that's we've always been a little bit more conservative, at least on this show, and say, don't bank on 7%. If house prices have gone up 8% a year in your area, which they certainly have in some parts of the country, maybe budget on 6%, maybe budget on 5%. Be that little bit more conservative, because rules like this can come in that may take a percentage point or two off house price increases.
And I think, if we are going to compare ourselves to one of these locations, Ireland's probably the most like New Zealand in terms of where it's at in its property cycle, or where we're at in its property cycle. We've had this downturn, not as much as Ireland, not the 50% that they've had. We've had more like 18%, 20%, but we're going to see that recovery now, and I think we're going to follow a similar trajectory in terms of the amount of growth. But again, don't go banking for these unusual years like a 12% anytime soon.
100%. And the other thing you've got to remember is right now, debt to income restrictions are non-binding. And I've talked about this in the past because banks can lend up to 20% of their lending at high debt to income levels. At the moment, they're only sitting at about 6%. So at the time that they're first bought in, not going to have an impact on house prices. As we've talked about on the podcast just a couple of days ago, actually it could have a boost to house prices because the deposit rules are changing at the same time. And again, we're not saying that Irish house prices went up by 6.4% a year after DTIs were introduced, so that's going to happen there. It's that house prices will increase at some rate. We don't know the exact rate. It probably will be a little bit slower than what it's been in the past. Right, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the Property Academy podcast. Really does help us get the message out to more people. Hey, if you're listening to the audio version of this show on your podcast app and you want to check out my graphs, just Google Opus Partners YouTube. It'll be the first thing that comes up. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We release new videos every Monday and Wednesday. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.